This is Lecture 1, Political Science and the Scientific Method. By the end of this lecture, you should be familiar with the scope and focus of political science, be familiar with the basic steps of the scientific method, understand how to apply the scientific method to political science research, and understand the purpose of scientific research. What is political science? Political science is the study of politics in a scientific manner. Political outcomes deal with any activity that is associated with public decision-making. Public decisions are decisions that affect large groups of people and are enforced by authoritative means. Political scientists strive to both describe and explain any activity that is associated with these political outcomes. There are many different types of political outcomes, and therefore there are many different subfields in political science that focus on different types of outcomes. For example, political scientists who study politics within different countries throughout the world study comparative politics. For example, some comparativists study topics such as voter turnout across countries. They try to explain why citizens in some countries are more likely to vote than citizens of other countries. Comparativists also study topics such as candidate selection across countries. They try to explain why party leaders in some countries have more control over candidate selection than party leaders in other countries. Another field of study is democratization. Political scientists who study democratization try to explain why some non-democratic regimes are more likely to become democracies and why some are not. Next, international relations is the study of politics between countries. International relations scholars try to explain outcomes, such as why some countries go to war while other countries are more likely to trade with one another. They also try to explain the role that international organizations play in the international system. For example, some scholars are interested in how the UN and NGOs influence human rights practices in countries throughout the world. And last, American politics is another subfield in political science. Americanists specifically focus on describing and explaining political outcomes in the United States. American politics includes such topics as congressional voting behavior, presidential decision-making, voting behavior among American citizens in different socioeconomic groups, variations in politics across U.S. state legislatures, and policymaking and policy implementation. Now we are going to talk about the scientific process. What is science? Science is not a collection of facts or a static set of beliefs. Science is a tool we use to try to explain how the world works. Within the scientific process, it is important to test all potential explanations of political outcomes, even if you do not think they are plausible. Knowing which explanations are supported by the evidence is just as important as knowing which explanations are not supported by the evidence. This allows us to gather evidence that helps us have more confidence in some explanations of political outcomes than other explanations. It is also important to be open to criticism. Criticism allows us to recognize what we know and what we do not know. If we do not know what we do not know, then we will never be able to correct our misunderstandings of political outcomes. In addition, finding out what we do not know leads us to new research ideas, further advancing the scientific process. It is also important to note that within science, all knowledge is tentative. We may have an idea of how the world works today, but we might find out we are wrong with new research findings. Now we will talk about the steps of the scientific process. The scientific process starts out with a question. We want to know why we see variations in certain outcomes. These outcomes are called dependent variables. For example, Many political scientists want to know why some people in the U.S. vote for Democrats while other people vote for Republicans. The dependent variable in this case is vote choice. Note that it is called a variable because the outcome we are interested in varies. It includes both people who voted for Democrats and Republicans. If you only examined individuals who voted for Democrats and ignored those who voted for Republicans, then you would not have a variable. Also note that the aforementioned question was general. Why do some people vote for Democrats while other people vote for Republicans? In science, we focus on general questions, not specific ones. We do not examine a single individual's vote choice. We focus on many individuals' vote choices. The next step in the scientific process is developing a model to explain why you see variation in a dependent variable. A model is a simplification of the world. In our models, we choose one factor that influences variation in our dependent variable. We ignore all the other factors that could influence our dependent variable. The factor we focus on is called an independent variable. For example, many political scientists argue that income affects vote choice. Individuals who are low income need more government services, so they are more likely to vote for Democrats because Democrats are more likely to support and expand government programs. On the other hand, individuals who are high income do not like high taxes. As such, they are more likely to vote for Republicans because Republicans are more likely to support tax cuts for the rich. As you can see, when you create a model, you are basically telling a story about how the world works. You are explaining how your independent variable, in this case income, influences your dependent variable, vote choice. Note that in the model I presented, I made assumptions about the preferences of high-income individuals. In every model, political scientists make assumptions. In this case, I assumed, for example, that high-income individuals did not value redistributing their income to the poor through government services. I made this assumption because intuitively it made sense. However, while I think this assumption applies to many wealthy people, I do not think this assumption applies to all wealthy people. So then why do I make a blanket assumption here that applies to all wealthy people? Simply because it makes writing the theory easier. The next step in the scientific process is deriving hypotheses from our model. A hypothesis is a one-sentence statement we derive from our model. It tells us how our independent variable should influence our dependent variable, and it is testable or observable in the real world. We should be able to collect real-world data and determine if the statement is valid or invalid. So, using the example from our previous slide where we discussed the influence of income on voting behavior, this here is a one-sentence testable statement from that model that describes how the independent variable should influence the dependent variable. As a voter's income increases, he is more likely to vote for a Republican than a Democrat. This statement is testable because we could conduct a survey and ask voters about their vote choice and their income. Then we could see if high-income voters are more likely to vote for Republicans than Democrats. So by deriving testable hypotheses from our model, it allows us to gather evidence that either supports or fails to support our model. The next step is actually collecting and analyzing the data to provide support or fail to support our hypothesis. In this class, we will be focusing on collecting and analyzing large N datasets with hundreds and thousands of observations. Since we have so many observations, we will need to use statistics to analyze the data. Some political scientists focus on small N datasets that only have a handful of observations. We generally call their types of studies case studies. In their case studies, they use thick description to analyze their data. This approach is beyond the scope of this course. Note that in our large N data sets, we have to collect data both on our dependent and independent variables. Recall the hypothesis from the example in the previous slide was, as a voter's income increases, he is more likely to vote for a Republican than a Democrat. If we were to collect data to provide support for this hypothesis, or failed to provide support for this hypothesis, we would have to collect data on voters' vote choices and their income. We could use survey data to collect this information. The last step in the scientific process is evaluating our evidence from step 4. Did the data support the hypothesis? Recall the hypothesis from the example in the previous slide was, as a voter's income increases, he is more likely to vote for a Republican than a Democrat. In order to analyze this relationship, I used real data from the American National Election Study from 2012. Based on the results of the survey, the evidence does support this hypothesis. Low-income voters are more likely to vote for Democrats than Republicans. 69% of low-income voters voted for Obama, while only 50% of high-income voters voted for Obama. In addition, high-income voters are more likely to vote for Republicans than Democrats. Only 20% of low-income voters voted for Romney, while 50% of high-income voters voted for Romney. Even if the evidence does support our hypothesis, we should not overvalue evidence. Before we draw definitive conclusions about the relationship between an independent and dependent variable, several studies need to provide evidence of the relationship. In addition, even if the evidence does not support our hypothesis, that does not necessarily mean that our independent variable does not influence our dependent variable. There could be several reasons why we get no results, many of them mathematical. But this is a topic that is covered in Political Science 398. Last, it is important to point out that in this class, we will be focusing on developing positive arguments, not normative arguments. Positive arguments attempt to explain how the world works. Normative arguments attempt to explain how the world should work. For example, a positive argument could be, income affects vote choice. Low-income voters tend to vote for Democrats, while high-income voters tend to vote for Republicans. These statements describe how the world works. A normative argument could be, income should not affect vote choice. Voters should vote based on the overall economic performance of the entire country, not their individual economic needs. These statements describe how the world should